China has decided not to go. Xi Jinping is not going to attend in person. And Vladimir Putin had long said he is not going to go either. Now, Joe Biden has expressed disappointment, he is saying. And after all of what both of you have covered so thoroughly and cover so thoroughly in your work, it seems like it shouldn't be so surprising. But I'm wondering if you could talk about, because at the same time that China, Xi Jinping, Russia, Vladimir Putin, they're not going to go to the G20 in person. They have committed to, and Putin himself has committed to going to the BRI forum, which is happening in October, the Belt and Road Initiative forum. And you mentioned BRICS expansion. And I'm wondering if you both could talk about how does China's maybe disappointment to Biden not attending the G20 kind of fit into this changing world, this multipolar world that includes the Belt and Road Initiative, the expansion of BRICS, and so many other multilateral mechanisms. Carlos, I'll let you begin.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, just on the G20 quickly, like, I don't consider this to be like a major snub that Xi Jinping isn't going to attend in New Delhi. You can't attend everything. He's just been to the G20 Summit. The premier is going, Li Qiang is going. So, you know, there's very high level representation from China at the G20. But, you know, and Biden says he's disappointed that he's not going to have a bilateral with Xi there. But, you know, Xi Jinping doesn't owe Joe Biden anything, frankly. You know, what's actually Biden from New Delhi, he's flying off to Vietnam to try and draw Hanoi into the US camp against China. So we know what his agenda is. You know, like whatever they say about wanting better relations with China, well, sanctions stay escalating. There's talk of expanding AUKUS. Just a couple of weeks ago or last week, there were new sanctions announced on China on utterly spurious grounds about putative human rights abuses in Tibet. They're allowing Taiwanese leaders to have bilateral meetings with top US officials. Frankly, you know, as I said, it wouldn't surprise me at all if the Chinese have just decided that Biden's simply not a man of his word and not someone that's really worth making a whole lot of effort for. And like, the US is going into election season. No doubt it's going to be fought again to a significant degree on the basis of who can be the biggest and who can be the loudest when it comes to anti-China rhetoric and when it comes to China bashing. So I think it kind of makes sense for China to focus on positive diplomacy with serious partners who mean what they say and do what they say. And BRICS being a prime example of that, or the BRI forum being a prime example of that. You referenced, Danny, the BRICS Summit. Obviously, that was a huge success. It hasn't received a huge amount of coverage in the Western press, it has to be said, basically because they're salty about the whole thing. But, you know, I think what we've really seen is that BRICS is becoming kind of the voice of the developing world and the sort of flagship institution of the multipolar process, which is why you've got so many countries applying to join. And there was a comment a couple of days ago by the Bolivian foreign minister, Rogelio Maita, who said, we in Bolivia, we're looking to the future, and the future is BRICS. And you had something similar from Daniel Ortega, I think it was yesterday, president of Nicaragua, who said, look, BRICS is the leader of the multipolar world. BRICS is where people are coming together, they're uniting for peace, they're uniting against poverty, they're uniting to protect the environment, to defend against climate breakdown, and so on. So BRICS has got this kind of trajectory, and it's got this momentum behind it. Obviously, the big headline story from the summit is the expansion, and that is really big news. You know, people have been talking about BRICS expansion for a long time. China's really been the leader in pushing that expansion process. And yeah, having Argentina, Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, it adds a lot of weight to BRICS. You know, it means that BRICS countries will now, or as of the 1st of January, account for nearly half the global population, nearly 40% of global GDP, and an awful lot of the world's energy production. And more countries are likely to join in the near future. Venezuela is obviously like, it's an obvious candidate. Turkey is a very obvious candidate, and so significant that both Iran and Saudi Arabia have been invited to join. You know, obviously both are major energy producers. It adds a lot of economic weight to BRICS, but also just the fact that these countries for 40 years have been mortal enemies. Of course, we saw in recent months China was leading on facilitating the rapprochement between the two countries, but it really highlights that, you know, BRICS is acting as a kind of as a unifying force for the countries of the global south, and the Iran and Saudi, like, they're sufficiently invested in the whole project that they can, you know, they can live with jointly occupying that space. It also indicates a very interesting and what could prove to be historically momentous shift in Saudi foreign policy, away from being this kind of dumb, unthinking proxy of US imperialism, which is not, you know, which is not to say that the Saudis have suddenly got some kind of socialist or anti-imperialist religion, but, you know, I don't think it's an ideological matter on their part, but it's a question of self-interest in the context of the overall momentum of global politics, the relative decline of the US, the rise of Russia, the rise of China, you know, with US hegemony becoming a thing of the past, it's in the Saudis' interest to have good relations with China, with Russia, and with other major countries, including Iran. Ethiopia joining BRICS. I don't know about you guys, you know, for me, like, being the age I am, like, I remember, you know, being a kid in the 1980s, at a time when Ethiopia was really like this byword for poverty. It was a byword for famine. And there was this racist, like, basket case narrative that totally ignored the West's role in impoverishing Africa, both in the colonial era and the neo-colonial era. But it's very moving now to see Ethiopia modernizing, to see Ethiopia developing and joining the ranks of, you know, dynamic emerging countries. It's Africa's second most populous country. It's been enjoying this rapid development in spite of, it has to be said, like, decades of destabilization orchestrated by the United States. And China's been a big part of facilitating that development. And that's another thing that it really highlights, the difference between China's approach to the developing world and the US's approach to the developing world. The US and the former colonial powers in Europe have been imposing underdevelopment on these countries for decades and indeed centuries, whereas China's engagement is emblematic of their development, of their modernization, of their industrialization, of precisely breaking the back of underdevelopment. Another key thing that was discussed, and maybe we'll talk about more, is this whole process of de-dollarization, trade in local currencies. I mean, realistically, I think the BRICS countries are likely too diverse politically, too diverse economically, to necessarily come up with a joint currency that could challenge the dollar. But certainly there was lots of discussion and serious discussion in Johannesburg about bilateral trade in local currencies rather than the US dollar. And that is, you know, that's part of this general trajectory towards breaking dollar hegemony. That's not going to happen overnight. You know, there are a few people on our side of things, on the left, and anti-imperialists, who imagine that breaking dollar hegemony is going to be a relatively easy and quick thing. You know, sorry to drop a spoiler on you, it's not going to happen overnight. It may well take decades, but it's a project and it's a process that's in motion.
Yeah, that's all that. Those are all really good insights and reflections, Carlos. I think that I want to reiterate what you said right at the beginning of that, which is to note that, you know, Xi Jinping may not be going to New Delhi, but China is going to be there. China is going to be there prominently. The prime minister, you know, Li Qiang, is going to be there, and so it's not as though they're snubbing this gathering, although the United States will always do, you know, whatever it can to make whatever China does to cast it in any possible negative light. So this kind of disingenuous disappointment on the part of Biden is just that's so shallow and kind of fakey. But I think that this shift that's taking place, the multipolarity, one thing that you said, Carlos, that I want to sort of pick up on a little bit is that multipolarity it's very diverse. You know, It isn't as though, I mean, back in the first Cold War, there was this whole ideological division. You were either in the free world or you were in the communist bloc, as they used to call it. That's not what's happening. This isn't, China's not out there crafting a new order, trying to put itself at the center of that. China is part of a process, a deep, I've said this a few times, I think already, this deep structural reconfiguration in the post, Western monopoly era, as modern productive technologies first sort of got dispersed around the world, initially with the Bolshevik Revolution, but then with decolonization. And now that a country like China is at the leading edge of creativity and innovation, that genie's not going back in the bottle. This is the way things are going to continue to develop. And China, I think, does serve for many people around the world as a kind of model, as a kind of beacon of a very positive path to a more just and equitable and prosperous future that's also ecologically sustainable, because all of those things are priorities for China in its development. But that doesn't mean that, China, we've talked about this in other contexts as well, China doesn't impose political conditions on its assistance and its engagement with other countries. Russia, admirable as their efforts are to be part of this process of getting away from American hegemony and domination. Russia is not a socialist state. It's not a socialist economy. India certainly is not, any kind of socialist or even progressive economic system. But that's not the point. It isn't that China wants to impose its system, its model on others. It will lead by example. It will provide whatever assistance, especially in that regard. I'm sure they would be delighted to assist other countries in moving in a more socialist direction, but that's not something that they impose on others. So it isn't. It truly is a multipolarity, a diverse multipolarity, and that's really important, because the United States, again, it can't conceive of that. The United States, first, there's this self-delusion in America that everybody in the world wants to be like us. Everybody in the world wants to be Americans. And that's, even to the degree to which that was ever true, it's certainly not true anymore, right? And that's something that I think, especially bourgeois politicians here, they just can't get through their heads. They think that unless a country is, the closer a country is to being exactly like the United States, a two-party electoral political system, whatever the movies are showing in the theaters are made in Hollywood, all these, everything they can think of, that's what's good. And to the degree to which a country diverges from that and doesn't seek to ingratiate itself and accommodate itself into the American system, to that degree, that's bad, right? That kind of thinking is what makes it so hard for the United States to figure out how to get along in this changing world. What we should be doing, what many, I think, American people, if they thought seriously about it, would want us to be doing, is figuring out how to get together with these newly emerging centers of growth and development and innovation to solve the problems that we're all facing. We have these massive existential challenges. And, sending John Kerry over for a meeting, that's great. They can have a productive discussion. Although as soon as he gets back, not John Kerry himself, but other politicians here, blow that out of the water by making these reckless and irresponsible condemnations and criticisms of China. So, the U.S. needs to get its own house in order and needs to figure out a positive path in the world, rather than just being, we're gonna circle the wagons and hang on to everything. And the last thing I'll say on that particular sort of theme is that when you look at the world, whether it's BRICS expansion or the BRI or any of these other emerging situations, the reality is that the rhetoric that gets spouted by Biden and others about how the world has united behind Ukraine, or united behind NATO, or united behind American, it's it's ridiculous. I mean, I guess some people believe that still, but well over half the people in the world live in countries that have voted against the American resolutions at the United Nations, that have rejected participation in the sanctions regime. That's just not. And again, I don't know whether they're deeply self-delusional or just so committed to trying to hang on to things that American politicians seem unable to come to grips with a changing world. And that, of course, only means that we're getting left behind even more rapidly than we would be if we tried to be part of the change rather than an obstacle to change.
Yeah, maybe to close your final comments on this, every time that China is accused of snubbing or not doing its due diligence diplomatically by the United States or the West, what ends up happening is you hear things like the EU now is pronouncing that it's going to take advantage of China's absence by kind of taking a high ground and working toward the African Union being fully admitted as a participant in the G20 mechanism. But at the same time, both of you have written, and you both have these 2 books out. I mean, both of you have written a lot about and spoken a lot about how not only is it something like the G20 itself so outmoded, but it's the difference between how China and the United States, China and Europe treat African countries in Latin America. Carlos, I know you wanted to talk about the China-Nicaragua free trade deal that just occurred. And both of you talked extensively about China-Africa relations. So could you maybe dispel briefly this notion that the Europe or the United States or the West in general can take advantage of China's absence in anything, given that much of the world sees it a lot differently, sees the U.S. and Europe's kind of unipolar approach to world affairs and development as being damaging and disastrous. And I think that's one of the reasons why Xi Jinping doesn't want to go to the G20. It's just not there. What point is there at this point? It hasn't really been useful for a while, and much of what the West participates in or leads hasn't been useful for quite some time. But I'll kick it maybe back to you, Carlos.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the free trade agreement between China and Nicaragua, and I think that's a really good example of the dynamic that you're talking about. Signed last week by both sides, by Laureano Ortega, who is the presidential advisor to Nicaraguan government, and Chinese Commerce Minister Wang Wentao. And Laureano talks about it as being like this is going to mark a before and an after for the Nicaraguan people, because it means more investment in Nicaragua. It means more jobs for Nicaraguans, more technology transfer from China to Nicaragua. It means more imports of goods, like relatively advanced goods like computers, more exports to the Chinese market. So in terms of Nicaragua's development, to tack on to a point that Ken was making earlier about development, this is a really profound and really important thing, a great example of multipolarity, of win-win cooperation, of mutually beneficial relations. It's not an act of charity on either side. It's 2 countries coming together as equals to improve their respective situations. And, it highlights the differences between China and the US, and certainly gives lie to the idea of like Chinese imperialism and so-called debt trap diplomacy and things of that nature. The Nicaraguans are very alive to the threat of imperialism and coercion. They're very alive to the reality, the actually existing reality of how the US treats them, how Europe treats them. They've dealt with it from the time of the Sandinista revolution, when the Sandinistas took power back in 1979. Like, they faced a decade-long war that was basically orchestrated by the CIA and the State Department against the revolutionary government. Today, they continue to face brutal sanctions. They continue to face economic coercion. What do they get from the Chinese? They get dignified treatment. They get treated as equals. and they got an opportunity to upgrade their economy and improve living conditions for their people. So China invests, China loans, there's no structural adjustment programs, there's no like punitive loan conditions, there's no austerity, there's no forced privatization, there's no forced deregulation. And, you know, that's China's engagement with the whole global South. There's a quote from Hugo Chavez that I referenced in my book, and that I've mentioned in a few sessions, a few podcasts, a few speeches. But Chavez said, "China's large, but it's not an empire. China doesn't trample on anyone. It doesn't invade anyone. It doesn't go around dropping bombs on anyone." So yeah, China these days, it's a powerful country. It's got a huge economy in purchasing power parity terms. It's the biggest economy in the world. But its rise has never been on the basis of colonialism. It's never been on the basis of neo-colonialism, domination, hegemony. It's been on the basis of being a huge country, as we were discussing earlier, being a socialist country, on the basis of having, has to be said, an exceptionally far-sighted leadership, and let's not forget, an awful lot of extremely hard work by the Chinese people. That's nothing like imperialism. That's nothing like how Britain became rich. That's nothing like how the US became rich. The US has engineered this entire world economy to work in the interests of American capital. And that's done via its unipolar world order. It's done via wars and proxy wars and destabilization and sanctions and dollar hegemony and economic coercion and structural adjustment and forced privatization, deregulation, every form of political pressure, every form of economic pressure. China doesn't do those things. China loans money, China invests, its loans come without conditionality. Their interest rate, interestingly, in spite of all this talk of debt trap diplomacy, China's, the export bank's interest rate is typically around half that of the major Western lenders. China's development banks show way more flexibility on repayment, way more flexibility on writing off debts. And again, it's only the Western countries that accuse China of setting up debt traps. China lends to dozens of countries in Africa, in Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere. They're not the ones complaining about debt traps. It's the US complaining about debt traps. It's Britain, it's France, it's Germany. So, it's much like the Xinjiang issue, where it's only Western countries issuing these slanders, is very obviously a case of projection and propaganda. So I think as far as countries like Nicaragua, as far as countries like Ethiopia or Argentina or Egypt or other countries that we talked about with BRICS expansion, as far as the countries of Africa, Asia, Latin America, Caribbean, the Middle East, Pacific are concerned, you can see you've got these two models of international relations that are asserting themselves very prominently in the world today. There's the model of imperialism, of unilateralism, hegemonism, unipolarity, and that's the model that's being promoted and pushed very hard by the United States with an attempt to transfer its domination of the 20th century into the 21st century. The other model is the model of multipolarity, the model of multilateralism, the model of international law, the model of adherence to and respect for the UN Charter, the model of friendship, non-interference, mutual benefit, and global cooperation to solve what Ken talked about earlier, like the existential crises that our planet and that our species faces in terms of climate change, in terms of pandemics, in terms of global poverty, and in terms of the threat of nuclear war.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add to that. I would one note, harking back to the question of Xi Jinping going to New Delhi. I think semi-seriously that he may simply want to deny Joe Biden the opportunity for a photo op. That as part of this pattern of trying to pretend that the United States is trying to work towards a better relationship with China. You can imagine setting up some sort of photo op there. Here's Joe Biden shaking hands with Xi Jinping, to show that he's willing to reach out and make the gesture. And now Xi Jinping won't even show up. But that's just obviously that would just be window dressing. That wouldn't really be any substantive action in terms of changing the overall direction of American policy. But I think Carlos, what you've been saying about the multipolarity and now the new trade deal with Nicaragua, these are it's just part of this slow but kind of inexorable process of transformation that the world is going through. And I think a lot of what we see, Gramsci talks about at one point, he talks about what he calls ideological inversion. Which really basically is the process of projecting onto the other the things that you assume have to be the motivations for actions. So, when American imperialism or European former colonial powers, when they look at the world around them, those kinds of political leaders embedded in that historical political culture project onto people all over the world exactly the same kind of motivations, exactly the same kind of cynicism, and the same kind of manipulativeness that have been characteristic of their own conduct and their country's conduct in the past. And of course, that's structured into the nature of the capitalist system. Capitalism is a culture. It is a mechanism of greed, of constant competition, of constantly trying to advance your issues, your agenda, your dominance in a market against the interests of others, right? And, so that's how they look at the world around them. And they turn around then and say, oh, if China is loaning money to these poor countries, they don't talk about what the details of that is. It's simply a matter of, well, they must be trying to get them into the debt trap, because that's certainly what we've done historically. And so China must be doing the same thing, even though, they can't actually demonstrate that. Major studies, many major studies of Africa and other parts of the world and finance consistently show that China is not, trapping people in debt, and that most countries that have problems with debt have problems with the IMF, the World Bank, private funding from consortia of financial institutions in the United States or in Europe. It's China's not the problem here, but American politicians and pundits can only think in those terms because that's what we do. And so, we invert that ideologically and project it onto the other, in this case, China, as a way of, as just the only way that we can comprehend it or frame it in our own thinking, in their own thinking.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyHaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.